Hey, it's Matt, your average gamer, and this is 30 overpowered builds in 30 minutes. That's right, we're going to go over 30 different builds in just 30 minutes. All of them do ridiculous levels of damage. Let's get into the details. And first up is the Raptor Talons build. The Raptor Talons build is really powerful. With the innate bleed and throwing Blood Flame on them, you can absolutely shred the majority of bosses in Elden Ring with these. They do a ridiculous amount of bleed buildup, damage in general. They even have a unique R2 flip that's a lot of fun to use. They can absolutely shred bosses. They build up in consecutive and successive attack stuff for a lot of damage. These are really, really good. Did a build on these recently. By the way, all of the builds will be in the description below. They'll all be attached, so any build you're interested in, be sure to check out. The Raptor Talons build is no doubt a very good one. The Godskin duo on Journey 7 went down fairly quickly. Obviously, we used Sleeping Pots as well, but it absolutely shredded them for ridiculous amounts of damage and bleed. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Raptor's Talons plus 25 preferably. Any seal will do. We have the Jar on and the Raptor's Black Feathers for the jump attack bonus. Rotten Wing Sword Insignia. Claw Talisman. We have the Lord of Blood's Exaltation for that bleed. Millicent's Prosthesis. And then we have the Thorny tier, and you can throw in the Faith tier for buffs as well. The main stats here, by the way, are Dexterity, and then you're going to need a little bit of Faith for Bloodflame Blade and buffs. Next up, we have Rogier's build. This one's really good for stance breaking. Rogier's build is great for stance breaking, by the way. Glint Blade Phalanx on the Ash of War does a ridiculous amount of stance damage. The stance damage that it does is roughly 31 per Ash of War, which is really fantastic. Casting this several times, you can stance break multiple times throughout the fight, then combine that using something like a rapier or any of the daggers that have high crit damage, and you're going to be literally stance breaking and then doing massive crit damage over and over again. This is an incredibly powerful build, and if you're a fan of the Flame of the Redmane's Ash of War, this is definitely now going to be a replacement. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have Rogier's Rapier with the Ash of War on it. Any seal will do. The Spellblade set will boost the damage on this. The Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman. We have the Dagger Talismans to take advantage of the crit. And then we have the Dragoncrest Greatshield Talisman. Then you're going to want to throw in the Magic tier for some extra damage and the Faith tier for buffs. Next up is a personal favorite, and one of the few holy builds on this list is Golden Order Greatsword, a really powerful one with a fantastic Ash of War. The Ash of War on the Golden Order Greatsword has two things to it. First is the initial explosion, the contact from the explosion, and then you have a follow-up beam that does immense damage as well. It has a fantastic Ash of War, has some good range to it with the beam as well, comes out very quick and actually be used in PvP too. Now let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Golden Order Greatsword plus 10, any seal will do. I was using the Knight's Cavalry set. We have the Sacred Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, Dragoncrest Greatshield Talisman, Shard of Alexander to boost that awesome weapon art. Then we have the Holy tier. Then you're going to want to throw in something like the Faith tier, or you can throw in the Defense tier as well. And next up is one of the easiest weapons to use and understand in the game is the Bolt of Gransax. It has an awesome Ash of War that has a ton of range, does pure lightning damage, and it's a lot of fun to use too. With some added buffs, this can absolutely hit like a truck. It's really fun to use this Ash of War, and as I mentioned, the range on it is absolutely fantastic, and that alone is literally a great selling point to it. The amount of range, the fact that you can cast and use the Ash of War from a good distance, very powerful weapon. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Bolt of Gransax, preferably plus 10. Any seal will do. We were proccing the Black Dumpling for an extra 10% damage. Ritual Swords Talisman, Godfrey Icon will boost this while it's charged. Lightning Scorpion Charm, Shard of Alexander, and then we have the Lightning tier. You can use something like the Faith tier for buffs or the Defense tier as well. The lightning damage on this, by the way, scales purely with dexterity, so get dexterity as high as you possibly can. You're going to get a lot of damage out of it. Next up, a personal favorite, Marais Executioner build. This weapon is absolutely fantastic for crushing bosses. In my recent video for this one, we did a whole bunch of extra buffs, buffed the damage like crazy, and it was really fun to do. We did it on max scaling, I believe, or around Journey 6 maybe, so a little bit before max scaling. It was really fun to use this weapon. Obviously here, Radahn went down to just 2 casts of the Ash of War, 2 uses of the Ash of War, which builds up on consecutive successive attack stuff, can absolutely shred the majority of bosses in Elden Ring, so really, really fun one to use. Let's get into equipment. Now for equipment, we have Marais Executioner plus 10, any seal will do. We had the Black Dumpling and the Mushroom Crown on for the extra damage, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Godfrey Icon, we were using the Kindred of Rot's Exaltation, Shard of Alexander. This will also benefit from the Thorny tier. Then you can throw in something like the Faith tier for buffs. Magic tier will also give this a little bit more damage as well. That's a really, really fun one. And the next one up is another favorite, is the Envoy's Longhorn Holy build. This is one of just a couple of Holy builds that managed to make it on here. The bubbles are absolutely ridiculous. This is an incredibly powerful build. You're going to see me absolutely melt Placidusax with this. It does ridiculous levels of damage. This was on max scaling. This is on the character I currently have that's on Journey 17 or 18, I believe. So at this point, obviously, we've hit max scaling, and he has around 40,000 HP. Still gets absolutely shredded by the Envoy's Longhorn. Works fantastic for larger targets. Even some of the smaller targets in the game, it hits hard too, because it does a little bit of posture damage and a whole bunch of holy damage to boot. Oh, and did I mention the Envoy's Crown will boost this by an additional 15%? Think about having 2 Shard of Alexanders that basically stack. It's absolutely awesome. Let's get into equipment. Now for equipment, we have the Envoy's Longhorn plus 10. Any seal will do. We have the Envoy's Crown for that extra damage. Ritual Swords Talisman. Shard of Alexander. Sacred Scorpion Charm. We have the Dragon Crest, preferably the Great Shield. Then the Holy tier. And you can use something like the Faith tier or Defense tier as well. And next up, we have the Starscourge Greatsword. 2 awesome weapons, basically one weapon that can turn into 2 weapons for a reasonable weight. They do a lot of damage. To get them from the Radon Remembrance, these are absolutely fantastic in Elden Ring. By the way, if you noticed I used all the titles from my videos, that was just a throwback to all the videos that I've done. I know each one says subscribe and stuff, and if you're not subscribed, definitely be sure to sub, but it was just a throwback. This is basically also a channel library, and it's going to help a lot of people because all the links are going to be in the description for all these builds. Meanwhile, back to the Starscourge Greatswords, really powerful weapons. These are really great too for people that are starting out. I've had some really good feedback on the build that I did for these. They're boosted by the Roar Medallion and the Highland Axe passive. It's a lot of fun to use these as well, and they obviously have reasonable weight too for 2 great swords, making them a good fit for trying out great swords for the first time, especially in the mid game. These are fantastic. Let's get into equipment. Now for equipment, we have the Starscourge Greatswords plus 10. We have any seal, the Highland Axe passive, the Raptor's Black Feathers on, the Jar on. The Roar Medallion will boost this, the initial hit. Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Dragon Crest, preferably the Great Shield. And then you can throw in something like the Magic tier or anything like the Charge tier. Or you can use the Faith tier for buffs as well if you want to throw in buffs like I usually do Golden Vow for that one. It's always good and helps out. Next up, Comet Azur, the full build. This obviously is one that can melt the majority of bosses in Elden Ring. Comet Azur in its entirety is ridiculously powerful. It's one of the most powerful spells in the game, if not the most powerful. When set up properly, it can absolutely melt bosses with a ridiculous amount of HP it can destroy. It's incredible. It's one of the best things to use as a mage. If you never use Comet Azur, be sure to. It absolutely wrecks. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have Lucette's Staff, any seal will do. We have the Jellyfish Shield. We have Azur's Glintstone Crown on for the boost. We have the Graven Mask Talisman, Graven Skull Talisman, Ritual Swords Talisman, Magic Scorpion Charm. And then you're going to want the Magic tier and the Infinite FP tier as well, so you can use Comet Azur for a full 15 seconds. Might be self-explanatory here. My mage is at level 200, but generally speaking, just get your intelligence to at least 60, which is the minimum requirement, and you'll wreck with it. Next up, the full status effect build. This is a really fun one and very overpowered. The Antspear Rapiers are absolutely ridiculous given the fact that they have 50 innate rot on each one, and then you can put an Ash of War on top of it. So for me, I like to throw in Poison, Seppuku, and Rot all in one. It's ridiculous. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Antspear Rapiers, one with Seppuku, one with Poison Moth Flight. They both have innate rot on them. Bronwing Sword Insignia. Kindred of Rot's Exaltation and Lord of Bloods can both be boosted by this, since the setup we're using boosts both. Millicent's Prosthesis, and you can use the Thorny tier as well. Next up is another personal favorite, the Darkmoon Greatsword. Really powerful weapon. By the way, if you see the days on this, it was a streak we were running up until DLC was announced. We got to 32 and then it was announced. The streak is technically still going on, but it was a lot of fun doing that. So for the Darkmoon Greatsword, we have that beam. Basically use it for a full minute at very little FP cost, and it does massive damage. This is a favorite weapon for a lot of people in Elden Ring, and I can't blame them. It's really convenient to use too. And another bonus is it actually does stance damage too. It does around 30 stance damage per beam. Obviously, it has that frost buildup too, not on the gargoyle here, but in general, it is a fantastic weapon to utilize as a mage, and it does pure magic damage that can be boosted by Terra Magica as well. It's a really powerful weapon, and it's something, if you're a mage, you definitely need to be using or trying out the Darkmoon Greatsword. It can make the game a lot easier. It's also a really fun weapon to use too. Let's get into equipment. Now for equipment, we have the Darkmoon Greatsword plus 10. Any seal will do. I had Lucette's Staff. We have the Spellblade set on because it will boost this with the jar for a little extra defense. Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman. Godfrey Icon. Shard of Alexander. Magic Scorpion Charm. And then we have the Magic tier as well. This is a really powerful one. Next up, Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike. One of my favorite builds in Elden Ring. Absolutely destroys bosses. This, as I mentioned, is a literal boss destroyer. When you buff Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike, it can absolutely wreck enemies, and it makes for very, very quick videos too, because everything becomes one shot. It is one of the best things to utilize as a faith build in the game. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Gravelstone Seal plus 25, a Seppuku Sword to bring our HP down, Jellyfish Shield, we have the Black Dumpling, and the Mushroom Crown. We've swapped out the Godfrey Icon now. Apparently that's no longer working for the Phlox Canvas Talisman in recent videos. We have the Lightning Scorpion Charm, Red Feathered Branch Sword, Kindred Rot's Exaltation, because you can poison proc this for more damage, the Lightning tier, then you can use something like the Faith tier or Bubble tier. Next up is a weapon that was really powerful, got nerfed, and then got a buff again. And I think in patch 1.06 or 1.07, it's the Sword of Night and Flame, which is again incredibly powerful. While the Sword of Night and Flame is a difficult weapon to utilize in the sense that if you're going to go for both of its abilities on its Ash of War, you need to invest in Faith and Intelligence. But it does have that powerful beam. The fire is really powerful too when cast in perfect timing. It does a lot of damage. It is a little bit slow, but between the two, they have high damage potential. Let's get into equipment. We have the Sword of Night and Flame plus 10. Any seal will do. We had Lucette's Staff. This was on my mage character. The beam can be boosted by the Spellblade set if you want to use that. Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Magic Scorpion Charm. Then you can use the Magic tier and the Fire tier, both of them, to boost both parts of the Ash of War and get ridiculous levels of damage. Next up is Moghwyn's Sacred Spear, a really powerful build that can absolutely shred bosses for massive fire and bleed damage. It's one of my favorite builds to use as far as bleed goes in Elden Ring. Awesome weapon, really has a lot of power on its Ash of War. While the Ash of War does make you a little bit of a standing target, it doesn't matter that much because it absolutely rips through bosses' HP, and if utilized properly in the sense of where to time it, when to use it, it does ridiculous levels of damage. It can usually proc bleed once or twice on the weapon art while also doing massive fire damage. You see Malekith go down there as well. It's a pretty hard boss, but even with a standing Ash of War, it's so powerful that it just doesn't matter. It can wreck the majority of bosses in Elden Ring. With Moghwyn's Sacred Spear, let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have Moghwyn's Sacred Spear plus 10. We're using the Dragon Communion Seal because it scales with Arcane, so why not? We have the White Mask on, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Fire Scorpion Charm for the fire damage. Use the Fire tier as well. It's an awesome setup, and the Faith tier if you want to throw in some buffs for even more damage. Moghwyn's Sacred Spear is ridiculous. Next up is the Rivers of Blood build. The Rivers of Blood build still shreds, still does a lot of bleed, and even after nerfs and then they gave it an additional damage as far as the physical portion in one of the recent patches, it still shreds. Is it as overpowered as it was at launch? No, but it still does ridiculous levels of damage, has an awesome and incredibly easy to use weapon art. This can still be a boss destroyer, and as I mentioned, the weapon art is so easy to utilize too, and obviously it does fire damage, it builds up bleed, and it has a pretty decent amount of range on it as well. The Rivers of Blood is still one of my favorite weapons in the sense of just how easy it is to use, and if you're having difficulty with any boss, it's still something that can absolutely shred, does a good amount of bleed and fire damage. It's one of those weapons that's pretty much always going to be around, it's always going to be talked about, still is. It's still an awesome weapon in Elden Ring, one of the most fantastic ones to use for that quick, powerful bleed buildup while also doing fire and physical damage too. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Rivers of Blood plus 10. We're using the Dragon Communion Seal again because it scales with Arcane, so why not? We have the White Mask on, Shard of Alexander to boost the weapon art, Millicent's Prosthesis, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, and then you can use something like the Thorny tier, the Fire tier. Next up, the Blasphemous Blade, one of the most reliable and awesome faith builds in Elden Ring. The Blasphemous Blade is incredibly powerful, and when combined with the Sword of Milos, you can use the debuff on it, and you can also passively, when you're going through regular enemies, get back FP and HP, and then obviously the Ash of War on the Blasphemous Blade will give you back health as well. It's an awesome weapon, does a ridiculous level of damage, scales very, very well with Faith too. The Blasphemous Blade is a personal favorite and one of the most reliable weapons in the game. Let's get into equipment. Now for equipment, we have the Blasphemous Blade plus 10. The Sword of Milos you want upgraded or not, doesn't really matter. I was using it for the debuff and the passive. Any seal will do. We have the Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, Dragon Crest, preferably the Great Shield. Then obviously we're going to be using the Fire tier, and if you want to use something like the Faith tier or Defense tier as well. Next up, the Scavenger Bleed and Frost build. Really powerful, absolutely shreds the majority of bosses in Elden Ring. There's a reason why everybody always talks about the Scavenger Curved Swords when they talk about Bleed and Bleed Frost. It's because they do a ridiculous amount of damage, specifically on Occult, but if you're using one for Frost, you can throw the other one on with Chilling Mist, do massive damage, and get both procs. Put Seppuku on one and Chilling Mist on the other, you'll actually have Frost that doesn't really have to scale with intelligence too much, so you'll be able to proc both of these with ease, and as I mentioned with the jump attacks, they absolutely shred. Even after the nerf to dual status effects, it doesn't even really matter when you're using the Scavenger Curved Swords because they have that much pure damage. The damage potential for them is incredible. They're one of the best weapons in Elden Ring. They're fantastic to use. Definitely be sure to pick these up. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have one Scavenger Curved Sword with Seppuku. We have the other one with Chilling Mist. Any seal will do. We have the White Mask for the bleed damage boost. We have the Raptor's Black Feathers, Ron-Wing Sword Insignia, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Melissen's Prosthesis, Claw Talisman. Then we have the Thorny tier and the Faith tier for buffs. Next up is the Black Knife, Black Blade combo build. These two actually stack for the percentage damage part and they do ridiculous levels of damage. Since the Black Knife's Ash of War scales mainly with Faith, and the Black Blade's an incantation, you can use these together, and though you only get one debuff, the percentage damage on both actually stacks, so they can do massive damage when comboed together. And this is actually one of my favorite builds in general. Being able to stack these two together is a lot of fun, but mainly because you get the whole Malekith Black Blade vibe by being able to use the incantation and then the Black Knife, which is obviously a really good weapon as well, to take on bosses in the game. It's a lot of fun, especially if you throw on something like Malekith's armor. A really cool looking combination too. It's obviously an aesthetically pleasing one. This is a really fun one, so if you're looking for something interesting to do, this is really fun. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Black Knife plus 10. We have the Erdtree Seal because it scales fantastically with Faith. We have Malekith's armor set on, not in that clip, but that's something cool that you can throw on. Shard of Alexander, Sacred Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, Dragon Crest, preferably the Great Shield, then the Holy tier and Defense tier. Next up is my favorite mage build in Elden Ring, and that is the Night Mage, which utilizes Night Comet, one of the most powerful spells in the game. When you use 2 Staves of Lost, you get a 60% boost to Night Comet before any additional buffs, giving it a high damage cap potential. Another thing that's great about it, Radagon, Melania, some of the bosses in the game that normally can see a lot of spells, can't see it coming, and you're able to hit them for a lot of damage. Night Comet is my favorite spell in the game. Let's get into equipment. The main thing here is using 2 Staves of Lost, and the 1 Staff of Lost that you're going to be casting with, you're going to want to upgrade. As far as the rest goes, I was mixing up a whole bunch of talismans, so you're going to have to check out that video for the exact talisman setup on this one, because as you can see here, it is a little bit confusing. As far as stats go, high intelligence, definitely check out that video. It absolutely shreds. And next up is the one-hit Giant Crusher build, a build that does ridiculous levels of damage in a single hit. While this one does do a ridiculous level of damage, it does involve a lot of buffing. We're utilizing the Giant Crusher for the pure amount of AR, the insane amount of damage that it has for its base damage, which is around 1,000, and then you buff that, do incredible damage. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Giant Crusher plus 25 on heavy affinity, a Seppuku sword to bring your HP down, any seal will do. We're using the Black Dumpling and Mushroom Crown, Axe Talisman, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Red Feathered Branch Sword, Kindred Rot's Exaltation, and then you could use something like the Charge tier, Faith tier for buffs as well. Next up is the Scavenger Curved Sword Pure Bleed build. We covered Bleed Frost, now we're going to cover Bleed Bleed. This is the one that really truly wrecks everything. It's absolutely ridiculous. The Scavenger Curved Swords are insane on full bleed. Since they have innate bleed on them, that's a big benefit for us because then with the occult affinity, it'll scale with the arcane, so we'll get a little bit of bleed before Seppuku that scales with arcane, while also keeping very good damage without sacrificing that damage reduction for blood. so the damage in between procs is absolutely insane. You're going to go for a pure bleed build. There really truly is, in my opinion, no better than the Scavenger Curve swords. They absolutely shred everything in the game. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have 2 Scavenger Curve swords with seppuku on a Colt, so they can scale with that innate bleed. Any seal will do. We have the white mask and the Raptor's black feathers on, Claw Talisman, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Melissen's Prosthesis, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, and you're going to want the Thorny tier and Faith tier for buffs as well. Next up is the Wing of Astel build, a really powerful sidearm for a mage and one of my favorite weapons in the game. The Wing of Astel is incredibly powerful. It's a great sidearm for a mage and it does massive damage. It's also pure magic damage that scales with intelligence, so it can be boosted by Terra Magica as well. It also does additional damage to gravity type enemies, and the spread on it is actually fantastic. The way it spreads out, it does a lot of damage. It can hit the majority of bosses in Elden Ring, and since there's a lot of bigger bosses, it can absolutely shred them. It's absolutely crazy how much damage it could do. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Wing of Astel plus 10. Any seal will do. The Spellblade set will boost this by 8%. Ritual Swords Talisman, Magic Scorpion Charm, Shard of Alexander, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman. Then you're going to want that magic tier as well. Do massive damage with this one. Next one up is the Crucible Knight build, which uses Reduvius' Greatsword, which has a fantastic Ash of War that hits really hard. This one can absolutely hit like a truck. It does posture damage on the Ash of War too. Another benefit here is it's a holy weapon that's Ash of War is about 80% physical damage. So even some bosses and such that are a little bit resistant or decently resistant to holy damage, this can still get through, do a lot of damage, a lot of posture damage as well. This one actually made the cover of the video, and I wanted to say real quick, if you're not subbed and you love overpowered PvE builds, be sure to sub. This has been awesome. We've been doing a ton of content lately, and we're going to continue to do more. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have Reduvius' Greatsword plus 10. Any seal will do. We have the Crucible Knight set on to go with the whole Crucible Knight theme. Shard of Alexander, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman. We have the Godfrey icon, which will boost this when it's charged. Ritual Swords Talisman, and you can use the Holy tier as well. Next up, the Shield and Heal build, one of the easiest builds to use in the game. The Shield and Heal build is a build that can block everything, and then any chip damage you get, because we're using Scholar's Shield and the Fingerprint Shield, you can heal back with a Blasphemous Blade. This is one of the easiest builds to use once you have the equipment for it in the game. It's fantastic for the majority of bosses. It can pretty much carry you through the game. Still works very well even after the Fingerprint nerf. This is an awesome build. And as you can see here, we're able to pretty much block everything without even losing too much stamina. As far as physical damage goes, there's not a lot that can guard break you. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Blasphemous Blade plus 10. We have the Demi-Human Staff, the Fingerprint Stone Shield. Any seal will do. We're using Scholar's Shield, Shard of Alexander, Great Shield Talisman, Great Jar's Arsenal, Ritual Swords Talisman. You use the Fire tier and Defense tier as well. Next up, one of my favorite Faith builds, and that is the All Fire build I did on my channel. This is a fantastic build that does immense fire damage. You can throw giant fireballs, and the Magma Blades go really well with this build too. This is one of the most fun builds I've done in the entire game. If you love fire builds, pyromancy stuff, this is definitely one you're going to want to check out. This is a fantastic build. Let's get into equipment. Now for equipment, we have dual Magma Blades, we have dual Giant Seals for the boost, we have the Fire Monk set, we have the Black Dumpling if you want for a little extra damage, the Shard of Alexander, the Godfrey Icon, the Ritual Swords Talisman, the Fire Scorpion Charm, and then we have the Fire tier as well. Next up, Death's Poker, another favorite weapon for a mage, a really powerful one at that. Now, Death's Poker has a couple things you can do with the Ash of War. I'm on Xbox. For me, the number one is L2 and R1, which leaves a trail that builds up frost and does immense damage. This weapon states that it scales with a D in intelligence. However, the Ash of War is more like a B. The Ash of War seems to scale much better off the intelligence stat. It's pure magic damage. It can do a ridiculous amount of frost, damage buildup. It's an incredible weapon to use as a mage. You get this from one of the Deathrite birds, and this is a weapon you should definitely have. If you're a mage and you haven't checked out Death's Poker, give it a chance. It has a ridiculous damage cap. Like the Wing of Astel, it can also be boosted by Terra Magica. In general, very, very powerful utility weapon for a mage. Let's get into equipment. Now for equipment, we have Death's Poker plus 10. I had Lucett's Staff. I had the Jellyfish Shield for different spells and whatnot, but it's not going to boost much for Death's Poker. We have Any Seal, Black Dumpling, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, Magic Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander. Then you're going to want that Magic tier as well. Next up, Black Flame build. This is a really powerful percentage damage and fire build. This utilizes the Godslayer's Greatsword. I'm going to do an updated build for this one soon. It's one of my favorite weapons in the game. It does percentage and fire damage. It's mainly a Dex Faith weapon. It's an awesome weapon to use in general. It does massive damage to the majority of bosses in the game. It's fantastic to use. Definitely something that you should check out. By the way, all of these videos are in the description below, so be sure to check this one out too. This is a really cool one. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Godslayer's Greatsword, preferably plus 10. We have the Godslayer's Seal. You can use 2 of them to get an extra boost. We have the Black Flame Monk Set-On, Fire Scorpion Charm, Shard of Alexander, Godfrey Icon, Ritual Swords Talisman, and we have the Fire Tier as well. Next up, Ultimate Tank and Poise build. It's a really powerful one. You can pretty much tank any hit in the game. This uses a combination of Endure and then just having a ridiculous amount of Poise by using the Bull Goat set and Bull Goat Talisman. You can tank pretty much all hits in the game. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Blasphemous Blade, Endure on a Dagger, any Seal, Bull Goat set on, Dragon Crest, Great Shield Talisman. We have the Pearl Drake Talisman. We have the Bull Goat Talisman. We have the Shard of Alexander. Then you're going to want that Fire tier and the Defense tier as well. Another really fun one that just makes you like as close to invincible as you can be in Elden Ring. It's a really fun build to do. Next up, the Reduvia Bloodblade build. This is another powerful bleed build. Everybody knows about this one. This is a fantastic build that gives you mid-range bleed and also up close. The Reduvias have a ton of bleed build up, really powerful. And as I mentioned, Bloodblade is awesome. If you make contact with both the dagger and Bloodblade, I believe you can get in a total of between 150 and 200 bleed buildup per, which is absolutely insane. Builds up bleed incredibly fast, does a good amount of damage at that. The Reduvia Bloodblade build is really good. It's also good against NPC invaders, and it's good in PvP as well because it can put a lot of pressure on enemies, and in general, just hit them really hard and proc bleed really fast. Yeah, this is no doubt a fun one. I really like the Reduvias, especially since you can get one so early in the game. The first one that you can get is actually in Limgrave, and they're so powerful. It's one of the early game weapons that can actually carry you very easily in the beginning of the game as well. Reduvias are awesome. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Reduvia Bloodblades, both plus 10 preferably. We have the Dragon Communion Seal because it scales with Arcane, so why not? We have the White Mask, Green Turtle Talisman, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, and then we have Millicent's Prosthesis you can use as well, Shard of Alexander. If you want to boost Bloodblade. Next up is the Meteoric Mage, which is a really powerful mage build that can use Meteorite of Astel to its full ability. This is one that utilizes Meteorite of Astel just like Comet Azur. It's one of those things where you can just basically spam it, use that infinite FP flask, and you can do it for 15 seconds straight, doing massive damage, especially to larger targets. Meteorite of Astel is incredibly powerful to use as a mage, does consistently good damage, and it's one of those things where while it has more RNG than say Comet Azur, especially for larger targets, completely shred them, does a little bit of posture buildup and damage as well too. Meteorite of Astel is undoubtedly a fun one, and it's honestly one of my favorite to use as a mage because it's a little bit harder than Comet Azur to pull off, but when you do pull it off, it does ridiculous levels of damage. It's a fantastic spell to have. If this isn't something you used as a mage, definitely be sure to pick it up. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have Lucette's Staff because it has really good intelligence scaling. If you're going purely for intelligence, it's fantastic. We have the Wing of Astel as a sidearm, the Meteorite Staff in the opposite hand for the passive boost, Graven Skull Talisman, Graven Mask Talisman, Ritual Swords Talisman, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. Then you can use the magic tier for a small boost, but it doesn't actually boost it that much, since it's mainly physical, and then use the infinite FP tier. Next up, Marika's Hammer, the awesome holy build that slams down and does massive damage. Marika's Hammer is really powerful. It has that same ability that Erduvis' Greatsword does, where a lot of it is physical damage, so you don't have to worry about too much with the holy being negated. For this instance, we're attacking an enemy here that obviously takes additional holy damage, but once again, does a lot of physical damage, and much like Erduvis' Greatsword, they have a lot in common with this, can actually do posture damage as well, quite good amount too. Let's get into equipment. For this, we have Marika's Hammer plus 10, any seal will do. You can use the Black Dumpling for a little bit of extra damage. You can poison proc this if you want to. Dragon Crest, Great Shield preferably, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, then we have the Sacred Scorpion Charm, and then of course we have the Holy tier as well. It's an awesome build. Well, there it is, guys. There's the literal biggest build video I've ever done in this game. This was absolutely incredible. I tried to keep my energy up throughout all of it, but it was a long video to record this one, to go over through it, to get all the clips for it. It's a pretty crazy video. I hope that helps. Everything's in the description below. We actually have a Discord that's been growing like crazy lately if you want to join that. Created a Patreon if you want to support the channel even further. That was a really fun one to do. This was a really cool video to do this. It was on the long side. I know that I usually don't do videos this long, but it was pretty fun to put all these together, to be able to voice over them, and then to have a library for the entire channel. As always, if you love overpowered PvE builds, be sure to sub, check out all the awesome builds that are on the channel, and I will catch you guys there.